A 1902 photograph captured a reflection that shouldn't have been possible. Dr. Evelyn Carter had dedicated her career to preserving African American history in the post-Reconstruction South. As the lead archivist at the Charleston Historical Society, she had seen countless photographs documenting the carefully constructed mythology of Southern prosperity and progress, but nothing had prepared her for what she discovered on a humid afternoon in June 2019. The photograph had arrived as part of an estate donation from the descendants of the Whitmore family, prominent Charleston society members since the antebellum period. The collection contained typical fare: formal portraits, garden parties, christenings. But one image stopped Carter mid-cataloging. It was labeled simply "Reception at Whitmore House, April 1902. The photograph showed an elegant gathering in an opulent parlor. Approximately 15 white guests, men in dark suits, women in elaborate dresses with high collars and ornate hats, posed formally before the camera. Behind them, dominating the composition, was an enormous gilt-framed mirror that reflected the chandelier-lit room. Carter had initially set it aside as unremarkable, but something nagged at her. She returned to the image, examining it more closely with a magnifying glass. Then she saw it. In the mirror's reflection, where one of the white guests should have appeared, there was instead a different figure, an elderly black woman standing in the exact position occupied by a white man in the main image. Carter's heart began racing. This wasn't possible. Photographic reflections should match the scene being photographed. Yet here was clear evidence of a discrepancy. She immediately scanned the photograph at high resolution and examined it on her computer, zooming in on the mirror's reflection. The details became clearer. The elderly black woman wore a simple dark dress, drastically different from the ornate clothing of the white guests. Her posture was rigid, formal, but there was something in her expression that conveyed profound pain. The scars on her face were unmistakable, whip scars, the permanent marks of brutal punishment. Carter sat back from her computer screen, her mind working through possibilities. This could be a double exposure, a common photographic error of the era, but the clarity of both images suggested otherwise. The main scene and the reflection were both perfectly sharp, perfectly composed. She began the methodical work of investigation. First, she needed to identify the people in the photograph. The Whitmore family records provided some context. The reception had been held to celebrate the opening of a new wing of the house, but the guest list mentioned no black attendees. Carter contacted the Whitmore Mansion, now a museum, and arranged an immediate visit. Walking through the mansion the next morning, she found the parlor easily. The distinctive mirror still hung in the same position. She stood where the photographer must have stood in 1902 and looked at the mirror. Carter pulled out a copy of the photograph and compared it to the current room. The architectural details matched perfectly. This was definitely the right location. But who was the woman in the reflection? Dr. Carter returned to the Charleston Historical Society, determined to uncover the Whitmore family's complete history. The archives contained extensive documentation of prominent Charleston families, including property records, business ledgers, and personal correspondence that revealed the intimate details of their lives, and the lives of those they enslaved. She began with property records from the antebellum period. The Whitmore Mansion had been built in 1847 by Colonel Richard Whitmore, a wealthy rice planter who owned 3 plantations in the surrounding low country. Estate inventories from that era listed his property with chilling precision: 247 enslaved people across his 3 plantations, plus an additional 12 house servants who lived and worked at the Charleston residence. The inventory listed them by first name only, age, approximate value, and sometimes a brief description of their skills or physical characteristics. Carter felt sick reading these documents. Human beings reduced to line items in a ledger, their worth calculated in dollars, their identities stripped down to their usefulness to their enslavers. She found one entry that caught her attention. Sarah, female, age 8, house servant skilled in sewing and childcare, value $400. The entry was dated 1853. If this Sarah had survived and remained with the family, she would have been approximately 57 years old in 1902, roughly the age of the woman in the mirror's reflection. Carter searched for more references to anyone named Sarah in the Whitmore records. She found scattered mentions in household account books from the 1850s and early 1860s. Cloth for Sarah's dress, Sarah attended to Mrs. Whitmore during illness, Sarah punished for impudence. That last entry, dated March 1859, was accompanied by a note in Colonel Whitmore's hand. 20 lashes administered. Will not tolerate disrespect from servants. 20 lashes. Carter closed her eyes, imagining an 11-year-old girl being whipped. The scars visible on the woman in the mirror suddenly made terrible sense. Those weren't isolated marks. They were the accumulated evidence of years of brutality, beginning when she was still a child. After the Civil War ended in 1865, the legal status of enslaved people changed, but Carter knew that actual circumstances often remained exploitative. She found a labor contract dated January 1866 between Richard Whitmore and Sarah, no surname. The contract stated that Sarah would continue working as a house servant in exchange for room, board, and $2 per month. $2 for a full month of labor. The contract also included a clause stating she could not leave the household without permission. Carter found similar contracts for other formerly enslaved people, all signed with X marks. Many of them had never been taught to read or write, making them vulnerable to exploitation through documents they couldn't understand. The contracts were renewed annually, always with minimal or no wages, always with restrictions on movement. She traced Sarah's presence through subsequent decades. Census records from 1870, 1880, 1890, and 1900 all listed a Sarah living in the Whitmore household, occupation listed as domestic servant. No surname was ever recorded. It was as if emancipation had changed her legal status, but erased her identity even further. During slavery, she'd at least been Sarah Whitmore in some records, identified by her enslaver's name. After freedom, she was just Sarah, no last name, no legal identity beyond her function as a servant. By 1902, Sarah had been serving the Whitmore family for nearly 50 years, most of her entire life. She had been enslaved for the first 20 years, then worked under exploitative contracts for the next 37. Carter wondered, had Sarah ever truly been free? Dr. Carter needed to identify the photographer who had taken the 1902 image. Photographers of that era typically signed their work or stamped their studio names on the back of prints. She examined the original photograph under magnification and found faint text embossed in the lower right corner. J. Matthews, Photography, Charleston. She searched Charleston city directories from the early 1900s and found James Matthews listed as a photographer with a studio on King Street from 1898 to 1911. Unlike many of his contemporaries who catered exclusively to wealthy white clients, Matthews advertised his services to all respectable persons, regardless of station. A coded phrase suggesting he photographed black clients as well, unusual for that era. Carter found more information in the archives of the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture. Matthews had been a controversial figure in Charleston's photography community. Several newspaper articles from 1903 and 1904 mentioned complaints from white photographers' associations about Matthews's inappropriate business practices. Specifically, his willingness to photograph black families in formal settings typically reserved for white subjects. One letter to the editor from 1904, written by a competing photographer, complained that Matthews was elevating Negroes beyond their proper station by photographing them in the same manner as respectable white families, creating a false impression of equality that threatens the natural social order. Carter felt a chill reading this. Matthews hadn't just been a photographer. He'd been using his camera as a tool of resistance, documenting black dignity and humanity in an era designed to deny both. Had he also used his camera to document uncomfortable truths that others preferred to ignore? She found Matthews' business records, donated to the Avery Center by his descendants decades earlier. His appointment ledgers showed that he had indeed photographed the Whitmore reception on April 15, 1902. The entry noted, Whitmore residence, formal reception 2 to 1:20 p.m., large format camera, multiple exposures requested. Multiple exposures. Carter's pulse quickened. Had Matthews deliberately created a double exposure, overlaying an image of Sarah onto the mirror's reflection? If so, it would have been an extraordinary act of subversion, embedding a truth that the Whitmore family and their guests would never have consciously noticed, but that would remain in the photograph forever. She found Matthews' personal correspondence in the collection. In a letter dated May 1902 to a fellow photographer in Boston, Matthews wrote, I continue to document what I see, not merely what my clients wish to be seen. The camera does not lie, though we who operate cameras often do. I prefer honesty, even when it must be hidden in plain sight. Hidden in plain sight. Carter was now certain this wasn't an accident. Matthews had deliberately created this image, embedding Sarah's presence in a photograph meant to celebrate white society's prosperity. But why? What had he wanted future viewers to understand? Dr. Carter expanded her search, looking for any documents that might reveal more about Sarah's life. She contacted descendant communities of formerly enslaved families in Charleston, sharing the photograph, and asking if anyone recognized the woman or had heard stories about someone named Sarah who worked for the Whitmore family. Within a week, she received an email from a woman named Dorothy Washington in Atlanta. Dr. Carter, my great-grandmother told stories about her Aunt Sarah, who worked for a white family in Charleston her whole life. She said Sarah had terrible scars on her face and never spoke about how she got them. My great-grandmother said Sarah was never truly free, even after the war. Carter arranged a video call with Dorothy, who shared what family oral history had preserved. Sarah's full name, according to Dorothy's great-grandmother, had been Sarah Porter. She had been born enslaved around 1845 on one of the Whitmore rice plantations. At age 8, she'd been brought to the Charleston house to work as a personal servant to Mrs. Whitmore and to care for the Whitmore children. My great-grandmother said Sarah was beaten regularly, Dorothy explained, her voice heavy with emotion. Mrs. Whitmore was known for being cruel to the house servants. Sarah once tried to protect a younger child from being punished, and Mrs. Whitmore had her whipped so severely the scars never healed properly. She was 11 years old. The story aligned perfectly with the 1859 entry Carter had found in the Whitmore records. 20 lashes for impudence, which likely meant trying to protect another child from violence. Dorothy continued, "After emancipation, Sarah had nowhere to go. She had no family left. They'd all been sold away from her when she was young. She couldn't read or write. The Whitmores told her she could stay and work for wages, but the wages were almost nothing. They controlled every aspect of her life. She couldn't leave the house without permission. She couldn't receive visitors. She worked from before dawn until late at night. My great-grandmother said it wasn't really freedom at all." Carter asked if Dorothy knew what happened to Sarah after 1902. Dorothy's expression grew sad. "She died in 1903, still working in that house. She was about 58 years old. My great-grandmother said Sarah's body just gave out. Decades of brutal work with barely enough food or rest. The Whitmores didn't even pay for a proper burial. The black community took up a collection to bury her in a cemetery for colored people." Carter felt tears welling up. Sarah had spent approximately 50 years serving the Whitmore family, first as property, then as an exploited worker with no real freedom. She had lived and died in that house, her labor building, and maintaining the wealth and comfort that the Whitmores displayed so proudly to their society friends. Dorothy sent Carter copies of family documents, including a small Bible that had belonged to her great-grandmother. Inside, written in careful handwriting dated 1904, was a note, "In memory of Sarah Porter, born into slavery, died still serving the family that enslaved her. She never knew freedom. May God grant her rest." Armed with Sarah's identity and story, Dr. Carter returned to James Matthews' records with new focus. She needed to understand his relationship with Sarah and why he had chosen to document her presence in such an unusual way. Matthews' personal papers revealed more than she'd initially realized. In his correspondence, Carter found references to a project Matthews called his True History series. In a letter to a photographer friend in 1901, he wrote, "I'm documenting what Charleston refuses to see, the labor that builds this city's wealth, the servants who make possible the leisure of the elite, the people rendered invisible by their society. When I photograph a grand reception, I also photograph those who prepared the food, cleaned the house, and served the guests. They are history too." Matthews had apparently developed a technique of creating composite images that included both the celebrated subjects and the unseen workers. Carter found several other examples in his portfolio, photographs where servants appeared in backgrounds, in doorways, or in reflections, while the main subjects remained unaware of their presence in the frame. But Sarah's image was different. Matthews had placed her in the mirror's reflection in a way that made her impossible to ignore once noticed, yet subtle enough that the Whitmore family had apparently never realized she was there. It was a bold act of historical documentation disguised as a standard society photograph. Carter found Matthews' journal entries from April 1902. On April 14th, he wrote, "Tomorrow I photographed the Whitmore reception. I have been in that house many times over the years, and I have watched Sarah work, an elderly woman who moves through the rooms like a ghost, unseen by the family she serves. She has worked for them for nearly 50 years, first as a slave, now as a servant who earns barely enough to survive. The Whitmores will celebrate their prosperity tomorrow, never acknowledging that it was built on her labor and the labor of hundreds like her." Fine. The next entry, dated April 16th, read, "I have completed the Whitmore photograph. I used a technique I have been perfecting. A brief secondary exposure during which I asked Sarah to stand before the mirror while the family remained still. The result is perfect. Sarah appears in the reflection where Mr. Whitmore stands in the main image. She is finally visible, finally documented, finally part of the history that has tried so hard to erase her. The family will never notice. But perhaps someday, someone will." Carter sat back, moved by Matthews' words. He had known that his act might not be discovered for years or even decades, but he had done it anyway, trusting that eventually someone would look closely enough to see what he had documented, the truth hidden in the reflection. Dr. Carter's discovery of Matthews' deliberate documentation technique opened a new avenue of research. If he had done this with Sarah's image, had he created similar composite photographs elsewhere? She began systematically examining every photograph in the Matthews collection at the Avery Research Center, looking for similar anomalies, figures appearing in reflections or backgrounds who shouldn't be there or whose presence suggested a different story than the main composition. She found them. Over the next several weeks, Carter identified at least 15 other photographs where Matthews had employed similar techniques. In one image from 1900 showing a wealthy family's Christmas celebration, a young black man appeared faintly in a window's reflection, carrying a heavy load of firewood, the labor that made the warm, festive scene possible. In another, from 1903, depicting a garden party, an elderly black woman was visible in the background near the kitchen entrance, her face exhausted, her dress stained from work. Each image told the same story: white prosperity and leisure made possible by black labor, with that labor deliberately documented by Matthews, even as his clients tried to exclude it from their carefully constructed narratives of success and refinement. Carter also discovered that Matthews had kept detailed notes about many of the black workers he'd photographed. In a leather notebook labeled Subjects of True History, he had recorded names, ages, and brief biographical details about dozens of servants, laborers, and workers. His entry for Sarah read, Sarah Porter, approximately 57 years old, house servant to Whitmore family since childhood, was enslaved until 1865, has worked for same family under contract since, bears extensive scarring from whippings received as child, has spent entire life in service to family that once owned her, represents countless others who are legally free but economically enslaved. Matthews' notes revealed a man deeply troubled by what he witnessed in the houses of Charleston's elite. He documented not just Sarah, but many others. Thomas, age 62, worked same rice plantation his entire life, first as slave, now as sharecropper who can never escape debt to landowner. Rebecca, age 34, domestic servant, sleeps in unheated attic room, works 16-hour days for $3 per month. Daniel, age 19, factory worker, injured on job, fired without compensation, now homeless. Carter realized that Matthews had created an alternative archive, a visual and written record of people who were systematically excluded from official histories. His society photographs, which appeared conventional on the surface, were actually subversive documents that testified to exploitation and injustice. She found one particularly striking journal entry from December 1902. I'm often asked why I bother to photograph Negro subjects, why I waste my skill and materials on those who cannot pay well and whose images no one wishes to display. I tell them it is good business to serve all customers, but the truth is this. I photograph them because someone must, because their lives matter as much as the lives of the wealthy families who hire me, because history should tell the truth, not just the stories that power once told. My camera is a witness. Let it bear witness to all. Dr. Carter wanted to understand Sarah's last year of life, the year after the photograph was taken. She returned to the Whitmore family papers, examining household records and personal correspondence from 1902 and 1903. What she found was devastating in its mundane cruelty. The household account books showed that Sarah received $2 per month throughout 1902, the same wage she'd been paid for decades. The books also showed extensive expenditures for the family's comfort, $150 for new parlor furniture, $200 for Mrs. Whitmore's trip to New York, $75 for their son's birthday celebration. Meanwhile, Sarah's entire annual compensation was $24, less than they spent on a single piece of furniture. Carter found a letter from Mrs. Whitmore to her sister, dated November 1902. Our old servant Sarah has become quite slow and forgetful lately. She can barely manage the stairs anymore, and yesterday she dropped one of my good plates. I told her, if she cannot perform her duties properly, perhaps she should find employment elsewhere. Of course, she has nowhere to go and no one to take her in, so she wept and promised to do better. Really, the ingratitude of these people is astonishing after all we have done for her. The casual cruelty of those words made Carter's stomach turn. After all we have done for her, as if enslaving Sarah as a child, beating her brutally, and then exploiting her labor for poverty wages for nearly 40 years constituted kindness. Carter found more evidence of Sarah's declining health. A letter from January 1903 mentioned that Sarah had been unwell, but was still expected to work. Another from March noted that she had fainted while carrying laundry up the stairs, but recovered sufficiently to complete her tasks. The final reference came in May 1903. Mrs. Whitmore wrote to her daughter, "Our servant Sarah passed away yesterday quite suddenly. She simply collapsed in the kitchen and never regained consciousness. The doctor said her heart gave out, though she was not terribly old. We have hired a new girl to replace her. She is younger and much more energetic, which will be a great improvement." That was it. Sarah Porter, who had spent 58 years of her life serving the Whitmore family, was dismissed in death with the same casual disregard she'd experienced in life. No acknowledgement of her decades of labor, no gratitude, no mourning, just a notation that she'd been replaced with someone more energetic. Carter found Sarah's death certificate filed with the Charleston Department of Vital Records. Cause of death, heart failure. Age, approximately 58. Name, Sarah, surname unknown. Burial location, Morris Street Colored Cemetery. Even in death, official records denied her a full identity. Carter visited the cemetery, a small, neglected plot on the outskirts of Charleston. Many of the graves were unmarked or had deteriorated headstones. With the help of cemetery records, she found Sarah's grave, a simple stone marked only with Sarah, D. 1903. No surname, no birth year, no epitaph, just her first name and the year she died. Standing at that grave, Carter thought about the photograph, about Sarah's face reflected in the mirror, visible only because James Matthews had chosen to document her presence. That photograph was now the most complete record of Sarah's existence, the clearest evidence that she had lived, worked, suffered, and endured for nearly 6 decades while being treated as invisible by those she served. Dr. Carter's research began attracting attention beyond academic circles. She published a preliminary article about the photograph and Sarah's story in the Journal of Southern History, and it was picked up by several news outlets. The story resonated deeply. Here was visual evidence of how supposedly free black workers in the post-Reconstruction South had continued to be exploited in conditions barely distinguishable from slavery. A civil rights attorney named Michael Robertson contacted Carter. He specialized in historical land and labor claims, working to document and seek redress for injustices committed against black Americans in the decades following emancipation. He saw potential legal significance in what Carter had uncovered. "These labor contracts you found," Robertson explained during their first meeting, were legally questionable even by the standards of that time. Wages of $2 per month for full-time work, restrictions on movement, inability to leave employment, these were characteristics of what some legal scholars call neo-slavery or debt peonage. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but these exploitative labor arrangements found ways around that prohibition. Robertson was particularly interested in the broader pattern Carter had discovered through Matthews's photographs. If Sarah's situation was representative of dozens or hundreds of other black workers in Charleston during this period, it suggested a systematic form of exploitation that had never been properly documented or legally challenged. Together, they began investigating whether the Whitmore family's wealth, which still existed in various forms through descendants and trusts, had been built partly on unpaid or severely underpaid labor. They examined financial records, property values, and estate inventories. The numbers were stark. Between 1865 and 1903, Sarah had been paid approximately $912 total for 38 years of full-time labor. If she had been paid even the minimal fair wage for domestic work of that era, approximately $15 per month, she should have earned over $6,800. The Whitmores had effectively stolen nearly $6,000 from Sarah over the course of her post-emancipation life. And Sarah was just one of multiple workers they had exploited. Robertson calculated that the family had benefited from hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid or underpaid labor over the decades following the Civil War. "This is wage theft on a massive scale," Robertson said, and it was legal, or at least it went unprosecuted. The legal system of that era was designed to enable exactly this kind of exploitation. Black workers had virtually no ability to challenge unfair contracts or seek legal redress for wage theft. Carter and Robertson knew that pursuing legal claims after 120 years would be nearly impossible, but they believed documentation mattered. They began working to identify descendants of other workers who had been exploited by the Whitmore family and other Charleston elite families. The goal wasn't necessarily financial compensation, but acknowledgement, an official recognition that these injustices had occurred, and that they had contributed to generational wealth disparities that persisted into the present. Through genealogical research and outreach to descendant communities, Dr. Carter and Michael Robertson identified over 30 living descendants of people who had been enslaved by or worked for the Whitmore family between 1840 and 1920. Many had family stories that aligned with what the historical records showed. Stories of ancestors who had worked for minimal or no wages, who had been unable to leave exploitative employment, who had lived their entire lives in service to the same family that had once enslaved them. Dorothy Washington, Sarah Porter's great-great-niece, became a vocal advocate for telling these stories publicly. She organized a gathering in Charleston in March 2020, where descendants could share their family histories and discuss how to honor the memories of their ancestors. Carter attended the gathering and listened as descendants shared stories passed down through generations. One man, Elijah Thompson, told about his great-grandfather Marcus, who had been enslaved on a Whitmore rice plantation and continued working there as a sharecropper after emancipation. He never escaped that plantation, Elijah said. He was born there, worked there his whole life, died there. The contracts kept him in debt. They charged him for seeds, for tools, for the shack he lived in. He could never save enough to leave or buy his own land. My grandfather said Marcus would tell them, "I'm free in name only. Everything else is the same as before." Another woman, Patricia Morris, spoke about her great-grandmother Ruth, who had worked as a cook in the Whitmore household from 1870 to 1905. "She cooked every meal that family ate for 35 years, Patricia said, her voice shaking with emotion. She prepared their elaborate dinner parties, their holiday celebrations, their daily meals, and you know what she was paid? $3 a month. By the time she was too old to work anymore, she had nothing, no savings, no pension, nowhere to go. She died in poverty in a charity home. The family she'd fed for decades never looked back." The stories continued, each one a variation on the same theme. People who had been legally freed from slavery but economically trapped in relationships that extracted their labor while denying them dignity, fair compensation, or the ability to build wealth for future generations. Carter shared the photograph of Sarah, now reproduced in large format so everyone could see the detail of her face in the mirror's reflection. There was silence as the group studied the image, Sarah's scarred face, her weary posture, her presence hidden in the reflection while the White family celebrated their prosperity in the foreground. "This is how they saw her," Dorothy said quietly. Or rather, how they didn't see her. She was invisible to them even though she was always there, always working, always serving. Mr. Matthews made her visible in this photograph, but it took 117 years for anyone to actually notice. The group discussed how to honor these ancestors. They decided to create a memorial and to push for historical markers acknowledging the exploitation that had occurred. They also wanted the photograph displayed prominently with Sarah's full story, not just as an interesting historical artifact, but as evidence of systemic injustice. In October 2020, the Charleston Historical Society opened a new permanent exhibition titled "Hidden in Plain Sight: The True Cost of Charleston's Prosperity." The centerpiece was James Matthews' 1902 photograph, displayed at large scale with a detailed explanation of the reflection technique and Sarah Porter's life story. The exhibition included other Matthews photographs Carter had discovered, each revealing the hidden labor behind scenes of white prosperity. It also featured the stories of dozens of black workers who had lived and died in conditions of economic exploitation after legal emancipation. The exhibit drew thousands of visitors and sparked community conversations about historical memory, reparations, and contemporary economic inequality. On the anniversary of Sarah's death, May 19, 2021, a memorial was dedicated at her grave in Morris Street Cemetery. Descendants of the Whitmore family's workers gathered around the simple stone that had marked Sarah's grave for 118 years. A new marker was unveiled beside it with a full inscription. Sarah Porter, born into slavery circa 1845, died 1903. She spent 58 years serving the Whitmore family, first as enslaved property, then as an exploited worker. Her labor, and the labor of countless others like her, built Charleston's prosperity. She deserved freedom, dignity, and fair compensation. She received none of these. We remember her now. We honor her labor. We acknowledge the injustice she endured. Dorothy Washington spoke at the dedication ceremony. Sarah never got to tell her own story, she said. She couldn't read or write. She had no power, no voice, no way to demand justice. But she was seen by James Matthews, who documented her presence when everyone else tried to keep her invisible. And now, more than a century later, we're finally listening to what that photograph tells us. We're finally acknowledging what was done to Sarah and to so many others. This is not just about the past. The wealth that was built on their unpaid labor still exists. The families that exploited them are still prosperous. The descendants of the exploited are still dealing with the economic consequences of that theft. Truth and acknowledgement are just the beginning, but they are necessary. Dr. Carter spoke next, reflecting on what the photograph had revealed. History is not just about great events and famous people, she said. It's about ordinary people whose labor made society possible, whose stories were deliberately excluded from official records, who were rendered invisible by those in power. James Matthews understood this. He used his camera not just to document what people wanted to be seen, but to reveal what they wanted hidden. He made Sarah visible in that reflection, and in doing so, he created evidence that would survive long after everyone in that photograph had died. We have a responsibility to look closely at historical images, to ask who is missing from the frame, whose labor is not acknowledged, whose humanity is denied. And when we find those people hidden in reflections, standing in backgrounds, visible only to those who look carefully, we must tell their stories. The Whitmore family's current representatives declined to attend the ceremony, but they did issue a statement acknowledging that their family's wealth had been built partly through the exploitation of enslaved and underpaid black workers, and pledging to support educational initiatives about this history. It was a small gesture, but it represented a shift, an acknowledgement, however incomplete, that the past could not simply be ignored or celebrated without confronting its full truth. The photograph itself became an icon of a historical recovery, a reminder that evidence of injustice can survive in unexpected places, waiting to be discovered by those willing to look closely enough. It traveled to museums across the country as part of exhibitions about post-Reconstruction America, about the long aftermath of slavery, about the ways systems of exploitation evolved but persisted after legal emancipation. For Carter, the work continued. She kept searching for other photographs where Matthews or other photographers might have documented hidden truths. She kept connecting with descendant communities, helping them recover stories that had been passed down orally but never officially recognized. She kept pushing institutions to acknowledge the full complexity of Southern history, not just the grand narratives of economic development and cultural refinement, but the human cost of that development, the labor that made it possible. the people who were exploited and erased. Sarah Porter's face, reflected in that mirror in 1902, had finally been seen. Her story had finally been told. And in museums, classrooms, and community gatherings across the country, people looked at that photograph and understood history is not just what powerful people choose to record. It's also what survives in reflections, in margins, in the spaces where someone brave enough decided to document the truth, even when no one was looking. James Matthews had looked. Dr. Carter had looked. And now, finally, the world was looking too, seeing Sarah Porter not as invisible property or nameless servant, but as a human being whose life mattered, whose labor deserved recognition, whose story demanded to be told. The reflection in the mirror had revealed more than Matthews could have imagined. It had revealed not just one woman's suffering, but the systematic exploitation of thousands. It had sparked conversations about justice, memory, and accountability that continued long after the photograph had been taken. And it had proven something essential. That truth, even when hidden, even when deliberately obscured by those in power, can survive. It waits in archives, in photographs, and family stories. It waits for someone willing to look closely enough to see what has always been there, hidden in plain sight, reflected in the mirror of history.